everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is surviving this continued quarantine. I don't know what y'all have been doing. I've been, in addition to grading and preparing these lectures for you, I've been watching a lot of bad TV. I've been making a lot of cookies and cooking a lot of food and kind of reorganizing my house. So hopefully you guys are finding fun ways to keep busy and, hopefully we're almost done. All right, so this week we're going to talk about ecological succession. This is our second to last topic, and I cannot believe that our year is almost over. Okay, ecological succession. So it's the process of ecological change in an ecosystem where one community is replaced by another community over time. There are two kinds. The first one is primary succession. The word primary usually means first, and that's the formation of a brand new ecosystem. So there was nothing there before. The second kind is secondary succession, and that is the recovery of a previous ecosystem. We'll explain what we mean by that in just a second. Okay, so primary succession. So that occurs when a community forms in an area that has not been previously occupied. A great example of this is when a volcano erupts and there's all that lava everywhere. Other examples would be exposed rock. So if there is a rock face and obviously that there is no living organisms there, that's somewhere where primary succession could occur. That sometimes happens when ice melts. So if a glacier recedes and exposes rock that was not previously exposed, then we can start thinking about primary succession. Also eroded sand. So occasionally, down on the beach or down on, wherever different coasts in the earth can have primary succession. So previously there was just sand, the sand erodes, primary succession takes place. This occurs over a long period of time. So this is not a short process. We're starting completely from scratch, so it's going to take a while. And the first thing we're going to see is something called a pioneer species. A pioneer species is the first organism to grow in a new environment. So pioneer, you think about pioneers, that came over on the Mayflower and first colonized America. Well, pioneer species are the first people on the scene in a new community. Typically, we see something called lichens and mosses. And lichens are really very similar to a moss. And if you've ever been hiking around in a park, sometimes if you'll see a rock that's near usually some moisture, you might see that green. It almost looks furry on top of it, and that's moss. The really cool thing about lichens and mosses is that they can actually grow without soil, and that is key to primary succession, and we'll find out why. So they can grow in areas that others cannot. Obviously, we know that most all plants and organisms, most all plants require soil to grow because they depend on the nutrients and all that good stuff. But lichens and mosses are pretty cool in that they actually break down the rock, and in the process, they create soil. Over time, these organisms decompose and release nutrients to form a layer of soil that larger, more complex plants can grow in. So basically, they break down the rock, and then when those plants die, they decompose. They turn, we learned about this in the, different geochemical cycles. So they break down and they release those nutrients and they start to form soil, which is pretty cool. Once enough soil has been generated to retain nutrients, small plants, flowers, ferns, and shrubs can begin to grow. So as the soil is coming on the scene, different plants will move in. And so now we know that plants can't walk. So oftentimes spores for these plants can travel through the air. And they can also travel stuck to the fur of different animals, or even sometimes birds will eat seeds for plants. And then when they poop, those seeds are released down onto the ground, and that's another way that plants can move in. So these plants can further break down the rock, allowing more soil to be formed and retained. So this is kind of a cycle that starts with moss and lichens, and then we get a little bit more complex plants, different kinds of weeds. They break it down even more. And over this process, we're getting some really rich, nice soil. The seeds from other plants, even trees, become able to grow. So if you think about it, a tree has pretty deep roots, even little trees. And so if in those very early stages of succession, they wouldn't have enough soil to grow, but now we're making new soil and it's good, nutritious soil. And so now we're able to support trees. Over time, large plants become able to inhabit the area. As new species of plants move in, new animal species become able to inhabit the area. So areas of land that animals were not previously interested in because there was no good food sources, now they are, and they start to move in. Organisms growing in each stage may even hinder their own survival, but pave the way for future organisms. So what do we mean by that? Well, in this picture here, you see a lot of lush trees and vegetation. That's not really going to allow a lot of opportunity for things like mosses and lichens to grow. So even though mosses and lichens kind of kick off this the process of primary succession, once the process kind of gets rolling, the environment's not so good for them anymore. So it's kind of like, even though they kick off the whole process, the process by which they break down the rock into soil is actually sort of a non-fulfilling role. They're actually eventually kind of edging their own species out. So it's kind of an interesting thing in ecology. Eventually, a mature community results in which there is little change in the composition of species. So, climax community, a mature and stable community of plants and animals. So, when we think about the word climax, you might think about in a movie. So, where does the climax come in a movie? It comes at the end. Because if it wasn't at the end, you wouldn't be interested in watching it. If the climax happened in the first 5 minutes, you'd shut it off after 5 minutes. If it happened halfway through the movie, you would shut it off after 45 minutes and not watch the end. So it's reached towards the end of succession. This is basically the process is finished and we've got our end product of primary succession. Secondary succession is a little bit different. Secondary succession occurs in an area that was previously occupied by living organisms, but the community was destroyed by a disturbance. An example would be a forest fire, farming, or a hurricane. And so secondary succession is something that happens that wipes out the community, but it leaves the soil. So secondary succession can only take place if there's already soil there. And there could only be soil there if primary succession occurred at some point in the past. So secondary succession is basically the soil is left intact, but all of the other plants and animals and organisms have been wiped out by whatever the disaster is. It is important to understand that although a volcano erupting is a disaster, because the byproduct of a volcano erupting is that the lava then forms into rock, when a volcano erupts, that is actually primary succession in most cases. Established community is destroyed, but the soil is still intact, so therefore it takes less time than primary succession because we don't have to start all over from scratch. A pioneer species for secondary succession is weeds and grasses. So because we already have soil, lichen and moss aren't the key players that they are in primary succession. However, you might still see some. It's just you're primarily going to see kind of that next step group of organisms, which would be weeds and grasses. The process typically begins with weeds and grasses that are able to grow quickly and proceeds until a climax community is reached. So they both have the same end game. It's just that secondary succession sort of starts one step ahead in the process. So where in succession would you expect to find organisms in stages that last for short periods of time? Short periods are at the beginning and long are at the end. So in the beginning, we have just a few species. So if you think about primary succession, we start with lichens and mosses. There's not a whole lot of complexity there, and so we move to the next stage rather quickly. Whereas as we get all the way to the end of the process, just before we hit that climax community, there are lots of different organisms and plants and animals and all that good stuff. So it's going to take a long time for them as a group to proceed to that last stage. Why might secondary succession tend to occur more quickly than primary? Because you don't have to start from scratch. You're already completed that first step and you kind of jump in the second stage. So obviously it's going to take a little bit shorter time. What kind of organisms would you expect to find in an area where disturbances are frequent or intense? Now think about that. If we're constantly having things like fires or hurricanes, what kind of organisms would you expect to be there? We would expect pioneer species like lichens, mosses, and shortgrass. So if that ecosystem is constantly being wiped out by hurricanes and things like that, we're going to find those pioneer species. So this is going to be kind of a quick chart just to bring all of this together. You don't have to copy this down, but you might want to either, when I get this all filled out, either screenshot it or just kind of maybe leave it open as you're working on the rest of the assignments because it can kind of help you. So primary succession. Building a brand new ecosystem from scratch without soil. What is the analogy we can use for that? It's like baking cookies from scratch with flour, butter, sugar, completely from scratch. An example of primary succession is a volcano eruption or when a glacier melts. The pioneer species are mosses and lichens because they can make soil, and that's so important. That's the only species or among the only species that can actually break down rock into soil. And the result is a mature and stable climax community. In secondary succession, we are recovering a previously existing ecosystem after a disturbance and the soil is intact. The analogy for that is baking cookies with pre-made dough. So instead of starting with all of the ingredients from scratch, you're skipping that first step. Everything is already all mixed together and you're just ready to form it into whatever shape you want and go ahead and bake it. An example, forest fires, hurricanes, or farming. Pioneer species are weeds and grasses. You may see some moss and lichens, but the soil is already there, and that's really important. And the result is also a mature and stable climax community. So you see the end result is the same. It's just that secondary succession kind of has a head start on primary succession. And that is all I have for you this week. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will see you at the beginning of next week.